Section 58 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance, by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Section 58, Chapter 37, Part 2. A murmur of satisfaction ran through the room, and the audience settled itself down to listen, as though they knew that the real business of the day was about to begin. Inglesant rose in his seat immediately behind his host. He was evidently dressed carefully, with a view to the effect to be produced upon a fastidious and ultra-refined assembly. He wore a cassock of silk, and the gown of a Benedictine made of the finest cloth. His head was tonsured, and his hair cut short. He had round his neck a band of fine cambric, and at his wrists ruffles of rich lace, and he wore on his hand a diamond of great value. He had, indeed, to one who saw his dress, and not his face, entirely the look of a petit maître, and even, what is more contemptible still, of a petit maître priest. Yet, as he rose in his seat, there was not a man in all that assembly who would have given a silver scudo for the chances of his life. His romantic and melancholy story, the death of his wife and child, his assumption of the religious life, and above all his friendship with Molinos, were known to all. It seemed to many a fitting close to a life of such vicissitude, that at this crisis he should sacrifice himself in the spiritual cause that was dear to all. He had his speech written before him, every word carefully considered and arranged by himself and some of the first masters of style then in Rome. He began deliberately and distinctly, so that every word was heard, though he spoke in a low voice. After depreciating the judgment of the assembly upon the artless and unpolished words he was about to address to it, and excusing his rashness in consenting to speak in such an assembly at all, he said, "The words of the noble and august personages who have already spoken have left me little to say. Nothing is necessary to be added to their wise and reverend advice. All that remains for us to do is to attempt to carry out in action what they have so well concealed. Our first object, our first duty, is the safety of our friends. But when this is happily accomplished, as under such leaders and protected by such names, how can we doubt that it will be? There are many among us who, with sinking hearts and hushed voices, are inquiring what part will come next." He paused and looked up for a moment, and a murmur of encouragement ran through the room. "I am not mistaken when I say that in this room, and also in Rome, are many hearts which, within the last few years, and by the teaching of him for whom night and day the prayers of the Church ascend to heaven, have found a peace and a blessedness before unknown. Many who have breathed celestial air, and walked the streets of God. Nor am I mistaken. My heart and your presence tell me I am not mistaken when I say that many are asking themselves, how can they renounce this heavenly birthright? How can they live without this divine intercourse which they have found so sweet, which the purest saints have hallowed with their approval? How can they live without God, who have seen him face to face? And many are asking themselves, must we leave the walks of men and the churches where the saints repose and wander into the wilderness, into byways among the wild places of hearsay, since the Church seems to close the gates upon this way, which is their life? I risk the deserved censure of this august assembly when I venture to advise. Yet even this I am willing to do, if I may serve any, and I venture to advise. No, I myself was born in another country, amid contending forms of faith. I believe that in the sacrificial worship of our most holy Church, room is amply given for the perfection of the contemplative state, and that such lofty devotion can find no fitter scene than the altar of the Lord. As we may hope that, at some future time, the whole church may come to this holy state, and be raised above many things which, though now perhaps necessary, may in a higher condition fall away. So, if by our continuing in this posture we may hasten such a happy time, this doubtless will be the path heaven wishes us to walk in. But he paused, and the whole assembly listened with breathless attention. If such is to be our course, it is evident that an understanding is necessary of adjustment between ourselves and the fathers of the Holy Office and of the Society of Jesus, an adjustment by which a silence must be allowed our faith, a silence which, for the sake of those amongst us whose consciences are the most refined and heaven-taught, must be understood to imply dissent too much that has lately been acted and taught. We must understand that this exertion of authority is aimed only at the open teaching of doctrines in which we still believe, and which are still dear to us, and that liberty is allowed our faith so long as we observe a discreet silence, a liberty which shall extend as far as to admission to the sacrament without previous confession. On this point, surely, it is necessary that we have a clearer understanding. Inglesant stopped, and applause sufficiently loud and unmistakable, sincere, showed that a large proportion of the assembly approved of what had been said. He spoke a word to Don Agostino, and then went on. I am willing to confess, and this august assembly will be willing to confess, that to the rulers of Christ's ark, those who have to answer for the guidance of the people of the world, and who know far better than we can the difficulties and dangers which environ such a task, this allowance to the lower masses of the people, so prone to run to extremes and to err in excess, would seem unwise, and I am not unwilling also to admit that we may have erred in making this way too public, before the world was sufficiently prepared for it. Both for this and for any other fault, we are willing to suffer penance and to submit to the Holy Church in silence. But this acknowledged and performed, we must be allowed, within certain limits, to retain the freedom we have enjoyed, and some manifest token must be given us that such will be the case. A singular murmur again filled the room, a murmur compounded of intense sympathy and of admiration at the boldness of the speaker. Inglesant went on. But you will ask me, how is this to be obtained? I am allowed to say that I have not undertaken the mission, save at the request of others, whom it well becomes to direct my service in all things. They consider that, for some reason, I am fitted for the task. I am, and I speak with all gratitude, a pupil of the Reverend and Holy Society of Jesus, and whatever I possess I owe to its nursing care. I am besides, though I have never acted in such capacity, still an accredited agent of the Queen Mother of England, that most faithful daughter, I'd almost said martyr of the Church. I will see the General of the Order, and if this assembly will allow me to speak in its name, I will offer to him our dutiful submission if he, on his part, will give us some public sign that we are allowed our private interpretation upon the late events, and our liberty upon the point which I have named. When Inglesant sat down, Cardinal Howard spoke. He was followed by several others, all of whom complimented the cavalier upon his devotion to so good a cause, but abstained from expressing any decided opinion on the expediency of his proposal. But when 2 or 3 speeches had been made, the mixed character of the assembly began to show itself. It is true that it had been carefully selected, yet, in order to give it importance and influence, it had been necessary to include in the invitations as many as possible, and the result was soon apparent. There were many present who had joined the ranks of the Quietists, more from a weariness of the existing order than from sincere devotion. There were many present who had joined them sincerely, but who, from timidity and caution, were desirous to escape the anger of the Inquisition by submission and silence, and who deprecated any risk of exciting a still more harsh exertion of authority. Both these parties, increased by waivers from the more devoted portion of the company, united in advising that no action should be taken farther than that which had been already used, and which, it might be hoped, had secured the principal object of their wishes, the release of their friends. They argued that confession before each communion could not be burdensome to those who were in a state of grace, and therefore had nothing to confess. And even if it were, as the fathers of the church judged it necessary for the suppression of error, and for the good of the ignorant and unenlightened, it ought to be submitted to most willingly by those farthest advanced in the spiritual life. These speakers also argued that many things which were held by the Quietists harmlessly to themselves were liable to be misunderstood, and that anything which tended to draw off the mind from the mystery of the sacrifice of the Mass, or from the examples of the saints, tended to divert the vulgar from devotion to the Saviour, and savoured of deism. They argued that although perhaps many things were unnecessary to those whose religious life was far advanced, such as the breviary, beads, images, many prayers, etc., yet it was not so to others, and that no doubt, where it was suitable, relaxation would be easily obtained from one's director. No one had insisted more upon the necessity of a spiritual guide than had Molinos, and it was now the time to prove the reality of our obedience to the voice of the Church. It was argued that many things in Molinos' writings seemed to tend towards Calvinism and the doctrine of efficacious grace, which no one present, no true child of the Church, could defend, a doctrine which limited the grace of God, and turned the free and wide pastures of Catholicism into the narrow bounds of a restricted sect. And it was finally hinted that there was some reason to believe that the promoters of the meeting were acting with a farther intention than at first appeared, and that they desired to introduce changes into the Catholic faith and discipline, under cover of this discussion. This last insinuation was a home thrust, and was so felt by the meeting. The subject of efficacious grace had also been introduced very skilfully by a young priest, a pupil of the Jesuits himself. After a brief consultation with his party, Inglesant replied that a great deal of what had been advanced was unanswerable, that he himself, a pupil of the Jesuits, was as much opposed to the doctrine of efficacious grace as any one could be, that it was the intention of no one present to urge any course of action unless the meeting unanimously approved of it, and that, as it appeared that the majority of those present were prepared to submit to the holy office, and did not desire any negotiation, nothing farther would be attempted. There weighed, in truth, upon the hearts of all, and had probably oppressed Inglesant as he spoke, a sense of hopelessness and of contention with an irresistible power. In spite of this feeling, however, the decision of the chiefs drew forth expressions of impatience and regret from the more enthusiastic partisans. But as these were mostly women, who could not address the assembly, or such as were not prepared to make themselves prominent in face of almost certain arrest, the discussion became desultory and ineffectual, and the meeting finally broke up without any decision having been arrived at. The piazza was full of carriages and servants, and the Duke di Ceri had an enormous train of equipages following his carriage to escort him beyond the gate, on the way to his villa near Civita Vecchia, whither he returned immediately, not choosing to stay in Rome. The meeting being over, Don Agostino urged Inglesant to leave Rome. Indeed, the Duke had already pressed him to accompany him to Civita Vecchia, but Inglesant declined. The motives which influenced him were a mixed nature. He was prompted by the most sincere desire to find out a way, both for himself and for others, in which the highest spiritual walk and the purest condition of spiritual worship might be possible within the Church of Rome. There was probably nothing in this world which he desired more than this, for in this was included that still more important freedom, the liberty of the reason. For if it were possible for the spirit to be free, while fulfilling the outward observances and participating in the outward ordinances of the Church, so also it must be possible for the reason to be free too. It had been this very desire, singular as it may seem, which had attached him to the society of the Jesuits. Not only were their tenets, notably that of sufficient grace given to all men, of wider and more Catholic nature than the Augustinian doctrines held by most bodies both of churchmen and Protestants, but the society had always, in all its dealings with men, shown a notable leaning to tolerance. Even so its enemies asserted of sin and vice. But besides these motives, which had something of a refined and noble character, Inglesant had others. A life of intrigue and policy had, from training and severe practice, become a passion and necessity of his life. To leave the field where such a fight was going on, to remain in Rome, even an inactive spectator, allowed to pursue his own path merely from the ignoble fact that he was not worth arrest. Both these courses of action were intolerable to him. He had promised Molinos that he would not be wanting in the hour of trial, and he would keep his word. He was utterly powerless, and, as the events of the last few moments would have shown him had he not known it before, the most powerful, the noblest confederacy, fell away impotently before an invisible yet well understood power, and a sense of vague, irresistible force oppressed him and showed him the uselessness of resistance. Nevertheless, he requested the loan of Don Agostino's carriage, that he might go at once to the general of the society. He was shown at once into a small cabinet, where he was kept, waiting a few moments, the general, in fact, being engaged at that moment in listening to a detailed account of the meeting, and of the speeches delivered at it. He, however, entered the room in a few moments, and the two men saluted each other with the appearance of cordial friendship. Inglesant had not changed his dress, and the general ran his eyes over it with somewhat of an amused expression, doubtless comparing the account he had just received with the appearance of his visitor, the purpose of which he was fully alive to. Inglesant began the conversation. "Your reverence is probably acquainted already with the meeting in the Piazza Colonna, and with its objects and results. I, however, have come to relate what passed as far as you may be disposed to listen, and to give any information, in a perfectly open and sincere manner, which you may wish to receive. In return for this, I wish to ask your reverence 2 or 3 questions which I hope will not be unpleasant, and which you will, of course, answer or not as it pleases you." "As I understand the meeting, Signor Cavalier," said the general, with a slight smile, "it rejected your mediation, in spite of the elaborate care with which the proposal was brought before it. a care extending to the minutest particulars and the chastened eloquence and perfect style in which it was offered. This sarcasm fell comparatively harmlessly upon Inglesant, preoccupied as his thoughts were. He therefore bowed, saying, "The meeting rejected my mediation, or rather it thought that no mediation was necessary, and trusted itself implicitly to the fatherly care of the Society of Jesus. What does the meeting representing this new hearsay demand? It demands nothing but the deliverance of its friends now in prison. And nothing else? Nothing else from the meeting. I'm here to demand something else. On your own behalf alone? On my own responsibility solely. But if my request is granted, many will be benefited by my work. Have you no abettors? You came here in Don Agostino's coach. I am Don Agostino's dear and intimate friend, and it is not much that he should lend me his coach. I have many friends in Rome. I know it, said the Jesuit cordially, and among them the Order of Jesus is not the least sincere. Inglesant bowed, and there was a slight pause. Then the general said, "What do you demand?" "I demand spiritual freedom, the freedom of silence. Freedom will be abused. Not by me nor by my friends. We pledge ourselves to unbroken silence. All we demand is freedom to worship God in private as he himself shall lead us. We ask for no change in public doctrine. We seek no proselytes. In fact, we confine ourselves to one desire, the sacrament without confession." The Jesuit made no reply, but continued to look fixedly into Inglesant's face. "It seems to me, Father," Inglesant went on, with a touch of bitterness in his tone, "that the society is changing its policy, or rather, it has a different policy for different classes of men. So far as I have known it, it has pursued a course of compromise with all men, and especially with the weak and frail. It has always appeared to me a trait much to be admired, that in which it is likeliest to the divine charity itself, but the world has been very severe upon it. And when the world says, 'You have pandered to vice in every form, you have rendered the confessional easy of approach, and the path of penitence smooth to the impenitent, you have been lenient, nay, more than lenient, to the loose liver, to the adulterers and men-slayers, surely you might be mild to the devout. Surely you might extend a little of this infinite pity to the submissive and obedient, to the pure in life and soul who seek after God. Difficile est satrium non scribere, namquis inique tam patiens urbis tam feris ut tenent se.' If the world says this, what am I to answer? For if it be so necessary to confine the soul to narrow dogmas, lest she go astray, it must be also necessary to deal freely and sharply with these sins of the flesh, lest they bring men to sensuality and to hell. By thus acting, as it seems to me, and not by making the righteous sad, you would follow the teaching of those beautiful words of one of your fathers, who says that the main design of our society is to endeavor the establishment of virtue, to carry on the war against vice, and to cultivate an infinite number of souls. You are a bold man, Signor Cavalier. For far less words than you have spoken, men have grown old in the dungeons of St. Angelo, where the light of day never comes. Inglesant, who rather wished to be imprisoned, and flattered himself that he should soon be released, was not alarmed at this menace, and remained silent. A pause ensued, during which something like this ran through the Jesuit's mind: "Shall I have this man arrested at once, or wait? He came to us well recommended, the favorite pupil of an important member of the society, who assured us that he was an instrument perfectly trained, ready at all points for use, and of a temper and spirit far above the average. not to be lost to the order on any account. He has proved all that was said of him, and much more. The papal throne itself is under obligation to him. But do we want such a man so much? I have scores of agents, of instruments ready to my hand, with whom I need use no caution, no finesse. Why waste any on one, however highly finished and trained? But on the other hand, I speak this in Rome, where everything is our own, and where the sense of power may have unfitted me from properly understanding this man's value. In the rough regions in partibus, such a tool as this, fine and true as steel, tried in the fire as steel, doubtless is not lightly to be thrown away. At all events, nothing is to be done hastily. So long as he is in Rome, he is safe, and may be clapped up at any moment. I almost wish he would leave, and go back to his teacher. All this occupied but a few seconds, and as the Jesuit made no answer, Inglesant, who scarcely expected any definite reply, took his leave. To his surprise, however, the general insisted on accompanying him to his coach. They crossed the courtyard to where the equipage of Don Agostino stood in the street. In the excited imagination of Rome at that moment, the sight of Don Agostino's carriage before the Jesuits' college had attracted a crowd. When Inglesant appeared, accompanied by the general, the excitement became intense. As they reached the carriage door, Inglesant knelt upon the pavement and requested the Jesuit's blessing. The foremost of the crowd, impressed by this action, knelt too. Inglesant rose, entered the carriage, and was driven off, and two different rumors spread through Rome. One, that the society had come to terms with the Quietists through the mediation of the cavalier. The other, that the Cavalier di San Giorgio had betrayed the Quietists and made his peace with the order, and this last report received the greatest amount of credit. End of section 58. Read by Elijah Fisher.